Donald Trump is proposing one of the biggest economic shakeups in recent memory. It's a multi-trillion-dollar gamble that he claims will rescue the American economy. His pitch is built on two core ideas: massive tax cuts and sweeping tariffs that he promises will unleash prosperity, bring back jobs, and make America rich again. But just beneath the surface of those promises, a fierce debate is raging. Who does a plan like this actually rescue? Is it you and your family? Is it Main Street businesses? Or will the biggest windfalls flow to corporate boardrooms and billionaires, leaving the rest of the country buried under an even bigger mountain of debt? The stakes couldn't be higher, and the numbers involved are simply staggering. So, we're going to cut through the political noise. We'll investigate the key parts of Trump's economic vision, from the tax cuts to the tariffs. We'll follow the money to see who really wins and who loses. And we'll tackle the central question: is this a blueprint for American prosperity or a high-stakes bet with the nation's future? So, what exactly is in this proposed plan? At its core is a philosophy we've seen before: the idea that the best way to grow the economy is to cut taxes, slash regulations, and let the private sector work its magic. But the scale of what's being proposed is immense. The first and most significant piece is making the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, or TCJA, permanent. Many of its key parts, especially those for individual income taxes, are set to expire at the end of 2025. Trump's plan isn't just to extend them, but in some cases, to push them even further. This is a central idea in Project 2025, a policy playbook developed by conservative groups for a potential new administration. This blueprint suggests collapsing the 7 current income tax brackets down to just 2, a 15% rate and a 30% rate. It also calls for another cut to the corporate tax rate, taking it from 21% down to 18%. Supporters argue that simplifying and cutting taxes will spur people to work, encourage businesses to invest and hire, and make the U.S. economy more competitive. The second major pillar is an aggressive new strategy on tariffs. The proposal lays out a baseline 10% tariff on most goods coming into the country, with much steeper tariffs, potentially over 60%, on goods from specific countries like China. The logic here is twofold. First, to shield American industries from what they call unfair foreign competition, and second, to use the revenue from these tariffs to help pay for the tax cuts or pay down the national debt. Finally, the plan pushes for deep deregulation across the economy, especially in energy, alongside proposals for significant government spending cuts. On paper, the formula seems simple. Lower taxes plus fewer rules and protected industries should equal more economic growth. But economics is never that simple, and the real question is about the consequences. A multi-trillion-dollar tax cut sounds good to just about everyone. But the critical question, the one that affects your wallet, is this: where does that money actually end up? When you break down the numbers from independent analysts, a very clear pattern emerges. While supporters claim the cuts help everyone, multiple studies show the overwhelming majority of the benefits go to the highest-income households and corporations. One analysis found that if the 2017 tax cuts are extended, the average tax cut in 2025 for the top 1% of earners will be around $61,000. For the top 0.1%, that number soars to over $250,000. Now, compare that to the rest of the country. For households in the bottom 60%, the average tax cut would be less than $500. So, while it's technically a cut for many, the scale isn't even in the same ballpark. The after-tax income of the top 1% is projected to jump by nearly 3%, roughly 3 times the gain for the bottom 60% of households. In fact, some analyses of Trump's overall proposals, including the tariffs, suggest that many lower and middle-income families could actually end up paying more. Economists widely agree that broad tariffs act like a sales tax, raising prices on everyday goods for consumers. One study on the proposed tariffs found that for the poorest fifth of Americans, the price hikes would be equivalent to a tax increase of over 6% of their income. For the middle fifth, it would be like a 5% hike. The richest 1%, on the other hand, would see a much smaller hit relative to their income at just 1.7%. This creates a situation some have called Robin Hood in reverse. The benefits from the tax cuts are aimed squarely at the wealthy, while the costs of the tariffs would land hardest on low and middle-income families who spend more of their money on essential goods. One comprehensive analysis concluded that when you put all of Trump's major proposals together, the richest 5% would get a net tax cut on average, while every other income group would actually see a tax increase. So, the benefits appear heavily weighted to the top. But tax cuts aren't free, which brings us to the next huge question. How are we supposed to pay for all of this? Right now, the U.S. national debt is sitting at over $36 trillion. That's a number so large it's hard to even wrap your head around. Put another way, the government is already spending far more than it brings in, and that gap is getting wider. The Congressional Budget Office projects that even if nothing changes, our debt will surge to an incredible $54 trillion within the next decade. A big reason for this is that the interest payments on the debt are now one of the fastest-growing federal expenses, costing taxpayers over $2.6 billion every single day. Now, let's add Trump's proposed economic plan to that fire. The Tax Foundation estimates that just making the 2017 tax cuts permanent would drain federal revenue by about $4.5 trillion over the next 10 years. Other ideas that have been floated, like getting rid of taxes on Social Security benefits, could cost another $1 trillion on top of that. Supporters of the plan say this isn't a problem. They argue two things. First, they claim the tax cuts will spark so much economic growth that the new tax revenue will pay for a big chunk of the cuts themselves. This is called dynamic scoring. But most independent analyses show that this growth would only cover a fraction of the cost. For instance, one analysis found that growth would pay for about 19% of a $5 trillion tax cut, still leaving a deficit hole of over $4 trillion. The second argument is that the tax cuts will be balanced out with aggressive spending cuts. The Project 2025 blueprint talks about eliminating entire federal departments and slashing programs. But fiscal experts are deeply skeptical. The specific cuts are often left vague or target areas that are politically almost impossible to touch. Historically, promised spending cuts of this size rarely happen, but the tax cuts do. If the revenue lost from tax cuts isn't replaced by miraculous growth or politically toxic spending cuts, the result is simple. Trillions more will be piled onto the national debt, at the very moment it's already at a record high. We're digging into the real-world numbers here, and I hope you're finding this breakdown useful. If you appreciate no-nonsense analysis of the policies that actually affect your life and your finances, please take a second to hit that like button and subscribe. It costs you nothing, but it makes a huge difference in helping us continue our work. Now, let's get to the biggest promise of all. So, the data suggests the plan benefits the wealthy and could blow up the debt. But the core promise, the entire reason for this high-stakes strategy, is that it will unleash a wave of economic growth that lifts everyone up. The final, crucial question is, will it actually work? To answer that, we can look at the recent past. When the 2017 corporate tax cut passed, Trump administration officials claimed it would lead to a $4,000 income boost for the average family. But extensive research done afterward found that for workers who earned less than about $114,000, there was no change in earnings from the cut. Instead, the windfall flowed mostly to top executives and shareholders through stock buybacks and higher dividends. Looking forward, supporters of the new plan claim it could boost GDP by several percentage points. But most independent forecasts are nowhere near that optimistic. The Tax Foundation, for example, estimated that making the TCJA permanent would lead to GDP being about 1.1% higher in the long run. That's something, but it's a fraction of the explosive growth that's promised, and it's not nearly enough to pay for the cuts themselves. And then you have the tariffs. While they're meant to boost American manufacturing, many economists warn they could seriously backfire. Tariffs almost always lead to other countries retaliating against U.S. exports. They can also mess up supply chains and raise costs for American businesses that need imported parts, which can lead to them investing and hiring less, not more. One analysis from the Penn-Wharton budget model projected that Trump's proposed tariffs could actually reduce long-run GDP by as much as 6% and lower wages by 5%. The fundamental disagreement here comes down to trickle-down economics. The plan is an all-in bet on the idea that if you give huge financial benefits to corporations and the wealthiest people, they will invest that money in ways that create jobs and raise wages for everyone else. Critics argue that decades of experience have shown this isn't what tends to happen. They say that money is far more likely to get funneled into stock buybacks and financial assets, which widens the wealth gap, while the national debt balloons and the services that average Americans rely on face cuts. So after digging through the proposals and the projections, where does that leave us? Will Trump's economic plan save America? Here's the takeaway. The plan is a radical and high-stakes gamble. It correctly identifies a problem, an economy that feels broken for many people, weighed down by sluggish growth and uncertainty. The solution it offers is a classic, supersized dose of tax cuts and deregulation, aimed primarily at corporations and the wealthy, all surrounded by a wall of tariffs. But the likely outcome, according to a broad consensus of independent economic analyses, is troubling. The benefits would be overwhelmingly concentrated at the very top. For many, if not most, middle and lower-income Americans, the higher costs from tariffs and potential cuts to public services could easily wipe out any small tax savings. And far from fixing the nation's finances, the plan is projected to add trillions more to an already unsustainable national debt. This looks less like a plan to save the American economy in a broad sense, and more like a plan to fundamentally restructure who wins and who loses within it. It's a bet that prosperity at the very top will eventually trickle down to everyone else. The evidence from the past and the projections for the future suggest that is a very, very risky bet. So, what do you think? Is this a bold vision for economic revival or a reckless gamble with the country's future? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for watching. If you want to understand more about how we got into this debt situation in the first place, check out our video on the national debt right here. See you next time.